Well, we're going to move to the east side now, and this is another situation where we need to give a shout out. Andrea Lyons had actually volunteered to give this talk and do this thing many months ago, and she also drug James Dickinson in with her, but then she got called to the chief's emergency event up there yesterday and had to bail out, leaving James holding the proverbial bag, but I'm sure he'll be terrific. They're going to talk about restoration strategy using EMDS, a new acronym for you, on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. James is a landscape analyst on that forest, and he's the co-author on this with Andrea Lyons, who's the acting forest wildlife biologist. So help me welcome James, please, while I bring up his stuff. And it's Dickinson right there. There you be. Oops.
Good morning. Thanks for having me come and talk to you today about what we're trying to do on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. First, we'd like to acknowledge not only Andrea, but also Richie Herod, Bill Gaines, and Paul Hesberg. Together, we've all put this restoration strategy together over the last few years, and we're really proud of it. And without any one of them, this would probably fall apart. So the objective of today's talk is to give you a good overview of the process that we're undertaking to restore large landscapes on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. I'm going to briefly talk about landscapes, kind of why we're focusing on landscapes. Tom Spees did an excellent job of covering much of this for me, but I won't go through it anyhow. And then I'll talk about the benefits and of the restoration strategy, as well as details, outputs, reference conditions. So the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest in 2010 actually wrote our first what we're calling the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest Restoration Strategy, Adaptive Ecosystem Management to Restore Landscape Resiliency. It's a mouthful, but it's a living document that was peer-reviewed, blindly peer-reviewed by our, which is kind of the definition of it, but peer-reviewed by fellow scientists and managers throughout the region. The restoration strategy analyzes complete subwatersheds. I mentioned that already. We're attempting to restore patterns, composition, and processes to increase overall resilience to climate change and to disturbance. So again, we're going back to this idea that our idea of restoration is making landscapes that are resilient for a number of structures and habitat features that we care about, resilient to these changes that we've seen through time and expect in the future. The key issues that we wanted to address in our restoration strategy were restoring resilience to the landscapes. Spotted owl recovery is a critical part on our forest. You've seen plenty of diagrams of where we're at, but we're a 4.2 million acre forest. We are the entire east slope of the Cascades in Washington, all the way down to the Yakima Indian Reservation. From there all the way up to the Canadian border. We wanted to address climate change. Road aquatic evaluation is an important part of our current ecosystem management. We're having some pretty dramatic impacts of roads and aquatics as they relate to each other. And adaptive management and monitoring, which we actually do value, and while we're still working to really bring that into play in our strategy on an annual or an everyday basis, it is part of our strategy itself in the sense that we revisit our strategy on an annual basis, update it with new science, new adaptations that we've made to our process, and then we also work closely with the PNW lab to try and bring in adaptive management questions and implement those. But there's a lot of work to do there, don't get me wrong. Our approach to solving the issues is, as I mentioned, managing for landscape patterns of all structures. We're not focusing in on any one structure at any given time. We want to restore native fire regimes across landscapes while planning for chance events. Restore native patch size distributions. That's still a work in progress, but is part of our objective. Restore spatial variability within stands. Develop long-term plans for maintaining our investment. So once you've invested that kind of money and time into these things, it makes sense to maintain it in terms of keeping a resilient landscape moving in the right direction, or a restored landscape moving in the right direction. Benefits of the strategy that we've found so far is that we're doing the right things in the right places. This is critical to us. We're making transparent decisions, we're preparing for the future, we're identifying those priority areas. We're not just blindly going out to that stand that's got tremendous value for whatever purpose you're looking at that stand. We're doing focused field work and with realistic timelines. Our specialists now are doing surveys in a known area with a known quantity of treatments and established parameters. They're not going out to an entire sub-watershed and doing a survey for the entire watershed, only the areas that we intend to do treatments. It's leading to efficient planning, although we're still working through kind of a long legacy of writing NEPA documents to cover potential litigations or lawsuits or appeals. But we're creating a process that allows us to actually write very pointed, explicit documents describing what we're planning on doing and why, rather than covering all of the issues. Integrated set of desired outcomes at several different scales, landscapes and stand levels, emphasizing and planning for outcomes, and we're incorporating science, support, and collaborations. We work very closely, or have been working very closely with TNC and Conservation Northwest and a handful of other conservation groups in Washington, as well as some of the timber industry, primarily through AFRC, American Forest Resources Council representatives. All right, so now we're gonna get into a little bit of nitty gritty. Well, actually, still overview, sorry. This is our restoration strategy in a nutshell. The green items across the top are analyzed with respect to historical ranges of variability. Starting over on the left, we've got fire and fuels, where we actually look at fuel loads and fire behavior based on stand conditions and sites. We have insect and disease vulnerabilities. We have a number of them. Right now we're using Doug fir beetle and spruce budworm vulnerabilities. Vegetation, we look at structure cover combinations and structure cover PVG. So where do those structure cover combinations live on the landscape? Wildlife habitat, for focal wildlife species, for us, it's spotted owl on one end of the extreme, white-headed woodpecker habitat on the other end of the extreme, in terms of what kinds of structural conditions do those species need. We've added in northern goshawk over on the Tonasket district, and we have also identified working with creating a lynx portion of the analysis. Climate change, I'm going to talk about this here in a few minutes, but climate change is assessed in which ranges of variability that we use for our comparisons. So I'll put a bookmark on that. We also have decision makers' priorities. So that's the landscape analysis. That's how we've analyzed our landscape. We have decision makers' priorities where we can incorporate those priorities to reflect current socioeconomic issues, and they can include additional data such as modeled fire, biomass and economics, which is a placeholder. We are still trying to build that component. It's data intensive and hard to get the data. And a rodent aquatic evaluation is in its beta testing this year. We should have that up and running shortly. But once we come out of the landscape evaluation, we have priorities for different parts of our landscape, which takes us to identifying these potential landscape treatment areas, these areas that we might want to go and do work. They're areas that should have high departures from ranges of variability with respect to climate change and historical ranges. We can develop a purpose and need and a landscape prescription that then feeds across to give us project level NEPA as we would typically do it. So about there, we're turning the corner on the NEPA triangle, as was shown earlier. Once we're at project level NEPA, then we begin to incorporate large and old tree guidelines, which are the intended to restore that structural backbone across our landscape of large trees There wasn't large trees everywhere in our forest, in our ecosystems. In terms of old forest, multi-story, what we envision as old forest. But we did have large trees. There was large trees in a lot of places. And those trees, especially when they're old, provide unique habitats for bats and other critters. We also incorporate stand level prescriptions at this point that reflect spatial variability within stands. And the process repeats for a different analysis area. So our timeline for this project, or for these analyses. Realistic timeline with an experienced analyst looks like this. With photo interpretation, yes, it's all photo interpreted. So it's a fair amount of investment there, but it's about 2 weeks with an experienced photo interpreter to do a sub-watershed. And another 7 days or so for doing the analysis and processing of data. But really that's 20 to 30,000 acres of analyzed landscape plus all of the data that you now have access to, which is pretty inexpensive. It's about 1,000 acres a day of analysis. Once we have that landscape level diagnosis and prescription that we've created in that first step, we then move into these potential landscape treatment areas where we can diagnose and prescribe and game with alternative developments to air quote, fix issues at the stand and at the landscape scale. It takes about 7 days. We typically aim for between 5,000 and 10,000 acres of restoration, or I'm sorry, of prescribed activities, some of which may be no action alternatives in some of those stands. We end up with a proposed action. We have stand-specific objectives and prescriptions and effects. And there's this little circle down here where obviously what you see and encounter on the ground in the stand helps drive what you do in some of your locations. But the intent is to do a majority of the work here in the office, ideally in the wintertime, and then take that information to the field with us and use that to inform our process back and forth. And again, there's a gaming, an iterative process where we can actually test out alternative scenarios of configurations of stands and habitats to see what's going on, to see if it continues to improve the landscape. But first, backtrack just a little bit. For decades, we've managed our resources at the stand level. We've identified a stand, set an objective, and frequently met those objectives. We are tremendous at meeting the objectives that we set forth in our stands as an agency. But landscape ecology tells us that it's not just the stand itself that we're treating, we're impacting the stands around it. Regardless of how hard we try, the stands that we manage are part of a bigger picture. Managing the stands of interest can be as important as managing the stands of not interest can be as important as managing the stands of interest. For example, spotted owl habitat that's currently occupied, it makes no sense to go and treat that stand itself, but it may make sense to go and treat other stands in relationship to that stand to improve the habitat and the viability and the longevity of the existing habitat. For any given stand, however, these are the kinds of questions that we typically should be asking and we don't always ask. How much of this is on the landscape? Where are the other stands of the same type? Is it unique? Does it interact appropriately with the other stands of the same type or of different types? If this is a wildlife habitat, does its prey live right next door to it? Is that good or bad? And does this, what I'm getting at is that you can see that the pattern on the landscape really matters. You can't just look at any given stand and try and create objectives out of that one stand. You have to look at least the patterns of that same stand across the entire landscape or across the entire analysis area. Functional large-scale landscapes are the result of being able to absorb disturbances while propagating the underlying processes. Those underlying processes are inextricably entwined with the pattern and composition of the landscape. The pattern and composition are composed or described by the patches with unique characteristics, and those patches are composed of trees and other vegetation, both live and dead. So it happens at all scales. And it follows if we can quantify and analyze the underlying pattern and composition at these smaller scales, we can begin to manage for the resilience of the larger landscapes. If anybody's done any reading or research in managing complex systems, it's about looking at the larger emergent process of the system while creating rules and treating or managing the underlying processes simply to allow the variability of those complex systems to create the unique system that it is, the unique emergent properties. So here's the pattern of a forest structure class. Doesn't matter which structure class we're talking about in terms of aggregation and landscape area. This is the envelope of conditions that occur across a sample of landscapes. So got the envelope, which is pretty obvious. Each one of those points represents a sampled landscape in terms of where it's at in that envelope. The star right there, the red star, is my current landscape example. And our approach to climate change on the Okanagan-Wenatchee Forest is to assume that as different climate regimes take effect, our ecosystems will begin to shift towards those patterns of the observed processes will begin to shift towards what is the new norm for that climate change scenario. They won't happen instantaneously, at least we hope not. But they'll begin to shift in a direction that accommodates that new regime. As you look at these climate changes over time, we expect that the envelopes of patterns will change accordingly. Each time climate changes, the aggregation and landscape area will morph to represent the new patterns and processes that are being driven by those climate change scenarios. We're managing our landscapes to push the patterns and compositions in a direction that is compatible with a warm, dry climate scenario. So, as Tom mentioned, we're not necessarily trying to get to where that black dot is in our restoration treatment, but what we're trying to do is slide our current landscape in that direction. It's a mile marker for us to aim towards, both in the current situation and in a climate change scenario. We want to avoid a feature of interest suffering a disturbance process that in one or two quick bursts removes it from the landscape. And that's what we were starting to see with the spotted owl habitats on our forest. Because we're a fire-prone forest, many of our spotted owl habitats have been removed effectively from the landscape over the last couple decades of the Northwest Forest Plan. For us, with static lines and static reserves, the idea of dynamic processes shaping the landscape nullifies our ability to offset those reserves. But back to climate change. Our ecosystems have seen different climates in the past. We want to buy them hang time to adapt if they can. We want to give them the opportunity to adapt. We're not trying to address climate change with the right answer. We're trying to come up with a good first approximation of what's going to happen to our patterns and processes as the climate warms and dries or warms and gets more moist. If we could find climate change analogs to use, we'd be set up for this previous slide I just showed you. Conditions where warm, dry, warm, moist conditions have had an impact on the pattern and composition, if we could find those on our landscapes, we'd be able to specify how those envelopes of patterns would need to morph to fit our climate change scenarios. Our approach has been to integrate or to incorporate the ecological subregions that were first developed by the Interior Columbia Basin Project and later modified by Paul Hesburgh in 2000. The entire Interior Columbia Basin consists of 54 ecoregions whose relationships we can track through a statistically derived hierarchical tree. In other words, we know which ecological subregion is warmer and drier than its neighboring subregion or a subregion of interest. This is my hypothetical development of landscapes. Really complex graphic. If we could go back and catch a snapshot, though, of these different landscapes, of our samples in these historical settings, we'd be able to measure some feature of interest and create a range of variability. We'd be able to define the envelopes of conditions for attributes of interest. And if we could do it across all of these different ecoregions, we'd be able to start looking at those warmer, drier conditions, those warmer, drier envelopes of conditions that existed historically. And that's actually what the Interior Columbia Basin Project did. All told, they photo interpreted 300 and some odd watersheds across the entire Columbia Basin. Attributes were derived for all those photo interpretations. I'll talk about that in a moment. Going back in time is difficult, but the oldest stereo photos available for the sampled watersheds were used to photo interpret these landscapes. So frequently that was just before a timber harvest occurred. You'd go back, you'd see the photos, perfect recon photo, you knew exactly where the timber harvest was going to happen, and that's usually what the subsequent photo sets showed. But really, what other options exist if we want to relate it to known processes and known observed circumstances of things going on in the landscape? These photo-interpreted watersheds represent about a 10% area of the ecological subregions that they were sampled from. So they are a statistically valid sample of the ecoregion. They also form they do form the reference conditions, both the HRV and the FRV, the future range of variability. Ooh, geez. So we also collect the same information on our current landscapes. For spotted owl habitat, we take our photo-interpreted attributes, we apply a consistent set of rules. We derive about 70 different items and use about 28 of them. Spotted owl habitat, spruce budworm vulnerability, risk of crown fire, forest structure, the list goes on. For each of those attributes, then we use frag stats to calculate or to quantify the pattern and composition on the landscape. We have landscape metrics, which look at the entire mosaic of all of the classes that occur for an attribute, like forest structure. And we have class level metrics, which actually look at each individual class and give us a quantification of what's happening with the pattern and composition of those classes. Our analysis then uses ecosystem management decision support, EMDS, developed here by Keith Reynolds at the P&W lab, to analyze the current state of the system. EMDS helps us identify where patterns and compositions are within the shared ranges of condition of both the historical and the normal for the the historical normal for the watershed's current ESR and of the warmer, drier ecoregion. So here I've got a warm, dry ecoregion and a cool, moist ecoregion. I've got a star up here in the top left to represent an example. This is a watershed that's for this particular attribute, is perfectly within NRV and FRV. It would not rate highly as being a restoration attribute. But the further it moves out of that range, the more departed it becomes from its historical norms and FRV norms, and the higher priority it becomes for a restoration target for us. I should note that the manager can still choose to favor one climate scenario over another due to a variety of reasons. And then EMDS allows us to take and quantify a whole boatload of information, 168 variables. Over here on the right is the landscape analysis. As we move further to the left, it's basically just a hierarchical yarding up of the information, a summarization, if you will. And this is where the decision maker's priorities start coming into play. A decision maker can influence or be more interested in wildlife over vegetation, or insect and disease over fire, for example. There's a lot of room for flexibility. We can also bring in additional outside information, as I mentioned earlier. Potential landscape treatment areas are then areas for us where operationally it makes sense to go and do a lot of work for the most restoration value. So by having a lot of departed stands in one area, we're maximizing our investment for time of recon and operations to go and do work there. Underneath all that information, or underneath those summaries, of course, is data tables, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it allows us to analyze at the landscape scale, again, what's driving the departures on the landscape. Evenness, diversity, the arrangement of contagion, interspersion, juxtaposition, those are all information that allows us to determine what is really happening at the landscape scale. And then also what's happening at the stand level scale. By digging in just a little bit deeper, we can actually figure out what are the things that as a manager we might modify on the ground to address those landscape issues, which are the purpose and need for that particular analysis area. Final overview of how this whole process works. We start with photo-interpreted data, which is locally done. We derive attributes. We calculate departures and priorities by resource area within EMDS. We can integrate and change resource weightings. We calculate other decision-maker priorities like landscape fire modeling and socioeconomic considerations. We develop landscape prescriptions and scenarios where we actually game through the process and see if it's going to fix the issue. We iterate through that as many times as we need, and then we come out into the traditional NEPA process. The restoration strategy is intended to develop a landscape approach that accounts for multiple resources and has a defined, transparent process and is efficient in its analysis. The strategy is able to put forward a reasonable approach to restore resilience across entire landscapes because processes don't just happen in one stand, they happen across many stands. There's a tremendous amount of detail that's summarized in the analysis, but all that information is available for additional work. While we're convinced that we can do a tremendous amount of true ecological restoration, we can still build capacity to provide ecosystem services, including biomass and traditional timber. For us, the hang-up really is just being efficient in the planning and implementation that bogs us down so slowly that we can't create those products that we need from an economic perspective. But the crux is that we must analyze and diagnose and prescribe and treat at landscape scales to achieve that goal. You can't do it all at the stand scale, and you can't do everything at the landscape scale. You have to do it at all scales. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Any quick questions for James? All right, he will be here with us for the rest of the afternoon.